A hard-working young woman is found bleeding in the street.
Suspense County 911.
He thought it was just a pile of trash until he saw the legs and then blood.
Oh my God, holy shit.
First responders struggle to put the pieces together.
I think she got hit by a car. She got head.
There were 4 casings found at the crime scene.
What happened, and who could be the cause behind all this?
Was she killed by a jealous lover?
She had been previously unfaithful.
Or by a stranger with an obsessive delusion?
She had a great body, and she made great money dancing.
Can the police bring her killer to justice?
He tells them the same story that he had told everyone.
When we asked him if he knew that he shot her, he nodded.
Everything just happened so fast.
September 12th, 2020. It's early Saturday morning in Beaufort, Georgia, a suburban bedroom community of almost 20,000.
Beaufort, Georgia is about 45 minutes northeast of Atlanta.
Beaufort gives you a nice small town feel, but still close to the city.
It's a very upscale area without all of the hustle and bustle of the inner city.
It's the last place you expect to find someone lying in the middle of the street.
Suspense County 911. Do you need police, fire, medical?
The 911 call came in approximately at 5:11 in the morning.
There's someone on the road, laid down, and there's blood on the ground.
The 911 operator is doing their best to calm him down, but he is in full panic mode.
The caller explains that he had just turned into the subdivision where he lives when he saw something in the road.
The caller states that he originally thought it was a pile of trash on the ground.
But as he pulled up closer, he saw legs and then realized that what he was looking at was a body.
Is it a male or female?
I have no idea. I drove by and I saw them.
The 911 operator dispatches police and paramedics to the caller's location.
When paramedics arrive on the scene, they're able to tell that it's a young African-American woman.
But unfortunately, there's nothing they can do for her.
She got head.
She has a gunshot wound to her head.
First responders are able to then identify her as 20-year-old Shakia Smith.
Shakia had always lived life to the fullest.
Shakia Smith was someone that was carefree, always smiling.
She loved life, she loved her family. Everywhere she went, she just brought smiles and laughter to the group. She was just a ball of light.
She was also ambitious.
She had goals of going to college and even owning her own home.
She really had a vision for what she wanted her life to look like.
But she soon discovered that pursuing her dreams required money.
She worked a lot of different fast food jobs. But Shakia realized that that was not going to be enough for her to live the type of life that she wanted.
So she found a more lucrative career: exotic dancing.
In Atlanta, that is a quick route for women who are beautiful to make money.
So she decided to take that route to get to her goals a lot quicker.
For Shakia, this was only a stepping stone on the path to her future.
This was not at all a long-term plan for Shakia. Shakia had planned on using the money that she got from dancing to pay for college so that she could really start to work towards her goals.
Soon, she was making good money.
Shakia was really good at it. Not only was she a good dancer, but she was also very charismatic. She had the perfect personality to do this job, and so she became very successful at it.
And it was through her work that she met the equally successful Moses Dial.
He was known for not just promoting, but also producing music videos.
Moses was a jack of all trades. He did a little bit of music videos, club promotions. He just knew how to get to the money.
He is about the life that Shakia is looking to have.
And he was only 25 years old.
Moses was tall, dark, and handsome. He was smart. He was funny. He had a military background. He was stable.
Hey, I saw you up there.
Shakia introduced herself, and the chemistry was undeniable.
They just hit it off really quickly.
Soon, Moses and Shakia began seeing each other outside of the club.
Shakia and Moses' relationship really progressed.
They move in together, but not in a traditional sense. They move from place to place, staying at different hotels. They're living the nightlife. They're out and about.
They really enjoyed that lifestyle.
But now, Shakia is lying dead on the street, and a peaceful Atlanta suburb has become a crime scene.
Police questioned the driver who called 911 after seeing the body in the street, hoping he might have seen the shooter fleeing the scene.
Hey, did you see anything?
But he only caught a glimpse of the body and doesn't even know that it's a woman.
No, I got here fine. I drove past. I thought that he was like a pile of trash or something.
But then he saw the blood.
Okay. I stopped and told her.
Officers hope they have better luck with the residents of the neighborhood.
Police began knocking on the doors and questioning the neighbors, hoping that someone had witnessed what happened.
No one they talked to saw anything.
But one neighbor states that he did hear about 4 to 5 gunshots before the 911 call came in.
I heard the gunshots about right after 5 in the morning, and then after that it was like a car driving like really fast.
20-year-old Shakia Smith had big plans for the future.
She wanted to attend college, and she envisioned buying a home for herself. She knew what she wanted her life to be.
She turned to exotic dancing as a way to earn money.
Particularly here in Atlanta, a lot of young ladies see it as an easy way to make quick money and use it as a way to catapult their way to the next thing that they want to do.
She was young, so she wasn't going to do it long. She just needed enough to save up for college.
And while working in the club scene, she met the person she wanted to build her future with, 25-year-old Moses Dial.
He was known for not just promoting, but also producing music videos, and he would bring on videographers, and he would bring on dancers.
But now her dreams have died in the middle of a quiet suburban street.
Shakia's body's just dumped, and she's just laying there, covered in blood.
The blood was still wet, and so the officers knew that this must have happened recently.
Police believe she died from a gunshot wound to the head.
On the ground near the body, the officers find 4 shell casings.
Right in the middle of the blood right here. Oh. That's a one of the dome. Yeah, it's a tiny little case.
They figured it might have been done with a .22.
Canvassing the neighborhood in search of witnesses provides few details about the shooting.
We had no witnesses that actually saw the incident.
There was a few neighbors who said that they had actually heard gunshots.
How many shots did you hear? I will say 4 or 5.
And then, one neighbor heard the sound of a car speeding away.
Detectives asked the neighbor about the sound.
Was it like maybe like an Asian import car, like the high-pitched sound, or was it like a low sound?
It was low sound.
He said that the car that they heard speed off actually sounded like a race car.
And as police go from door to door, officers notice something that could blow the case wide open.
We apologize for waking up in the morning.
The officers realized that some of the homes in the community actually have doorbell cameras.
So can you tell me, does your camera, does it see anything that's happening in the roadway?
There is one house that has a camera that was facing the area.
If you would just go through your footage, if you see or hear any gunshots, we would like to know about that, please. Yep, absolutely.
They're hoping the security camera captured the whole incident.
If that camera can see anything through these trees, I'll be surprised.
But when the footage is sent to detectives assigned to the case, they see more than just trees.
Homicide. I received a phone call from one of my sergeants who informed me that there was a homicide and that the neighbors had footage.
And viewing the footage, they do see a car entering the neighborhood, but they can't make out the license plate, nor do they see who's driving the car.
Despite that, the video has a story to tell.
You could hear a male yelling.
They could hear faint voices. It sounded like an argument, and then the next thing they heard were 4 gunshots.
It's an important piece of evidence.
The video gave them the exact time of the shooting, and now they have a suspect, the man whose voice they could hear shouting.
But it doesn't explain what happened.
The footage doesn't give them any inkling as to who did it and what the motive was.
However, while police are still knocking on doors, the detectives are notified of a second 911 call that was made shortly after the call reporting Shakia in the street.
They got another 911 call from a man who was completely frantic.
The location of your emergency?
I'm calling because I'm trying to find my girlfriend.
The caller said he had gotten into an argument with his girlfriend while they were on their way to pick up a friend.
They got into an argument, and she abruptly gets out of the car.
When she walked, I tried to talk to her, and she was just like, "Oh, don't even talk to me.
Will you please just leave me alone?"
He tries to follow her and convince her to get back in the car.
Next thing I know, she hops into the next car that was coming the opposite way.
He said she jumped into the car with someone else and drove off.
The caller said that he tried to follow them, but he lost track of the car.
He was very afraid that something has happened to her.
They're able to put together that this is Moses, and he is calling about his girlfriend, Shakia Smith.
Detectives investigating the murder of 20-year-old Shakia Smith have just learned that around the time of the shooting, her boyfriend called 911 requesting help to find her.
Moses Dial told the operator that he was afraid that something terrible had happened to his girlfriend.
He had no idea that Shakia was dead.
On the call, Moses explained that they had gotten into an argument after he picked Shakia up from work.
He says the argument starts when she starts going through his phone.
Who is this?
A friend. My girlfriend's reading stuff on my phone, and she's just like, "Oh, why are you still texting this girl?"
Shakia gets upset with him.
Shakia is livid with this text message. She doesn't understand why he's still texting this girl, and it just spirals from there.
Shakia was drunk, yelling at him.
I'm just like, babe, chill out. I'm just talking business with this other girl. What is the problem?
And suddenly the argument escalated and became dangerous.
She becomes irate and eventually pulls out her gun.
She pulls out the gun, and I'm just like, oh, so you about to shoot me now?
Shakia says no, and she tells him to just leave her alone, and she just jumps out of the car.
Moses tries to follow her and convince her to get back in the car.
Go text that other girl on your phone.
Can you please get in the car?
Can you please leave me alone, Moses?
But he says from there she jumped into the car with someone else and drove off.
Does she know the person at all?
No, because we're not even from around this area, man.
Kia!
He described a dark-colored passenger car picking up Shakia getting into that car and leaving.
Moses said he tried to follow them, but it was too late.
He says that by the time he made the turn, they were long gone and he had no idea where they were.
Moses told the operator he wasn't really alarmed. At first.
Moses states this isn't new. She's jumped in the car with strangers before. She does this when she gets upset.
She'll hop into somebody's car and won't come back until about 11 o'clock in the morning.
But he said this time felt different.
I have my son trying to look around for her, too, and I try calling her mom. Her mom's not answering.
During this conversation, 911 is trying to find out where Moses is. He tells them that he is somewhere on Buford Highway.
The dispatcher then asks Moses to pull over and give them his exact location so that the police could find him and help him search for Shakia.
At that moment, the phone gets disconnected.
The dispatcher tried to call Moses back several times, but unfortunately, they got hit with the voicemail that's not set up.
After listening to the recording, detectives reach out to Moses and get the same voicemail.
Sorry, but the person you called has a voicemail box that has not been set up yet.
Before detectives can track Moses down, a new lead develops at the crime scene.
A mutual friend of both Moses and Shakia, Charlene James, comes to the crime scene.
Charlene told the officers working the scene that Moses Dial and Shakia were on their way to pick her up early that morning when they got into an argument.
And she confirms what Moses told the 911 operator.
Charlene says that Shakia had hopped out of Moses' car and hopped into the car of a stranger.
I'm told she hopped in a car, a black car, and they rolled out this neighborhood.
When they asked Charlene where did she get that information, she says Moses told her that.
She says that Moses told her that he tried to chase them and that he has been driving around ever since trying to find her.
I don't know how she ended up back over here, but she did. And my dad's not
Charlene says she isn't sure where Moses is now.
Charlene said that Moses had linked up with Shakia's mom, and together the two of them were looking for Shakia way on the other side of town.
She gives the police Shakia's mom's number.
Police give her mother a call and ask her to go down to the station.
When they call Shakia's mom, Moses is not with her, but she does agree to come down to the station and have a conversation with them.
Police also asked Charlene to follow them to the police headquarters.
When Shakia's mother arrives, they give her the bad news.
I'm sorry.
Despite her grief, she's determined to do what she can to help solve her daughter's murder.
Mom tells the police that she did receive a call from Shakia at 4 a.m.
I never got that call. I was asleep.
2 hours later, Moses called her and told her that Shakia was missing.
Moses explained to her that they had an argument and she had gotten out of his vehicle and entered somebody else's vehicle. and left. And he was trying to locate her.
Shakia's mother, however, isn't as trusting as Charlene.
Shakia's mom lets the officers know that she actually doesn't believe this story.
Don't trust Moses.
She feels like Moses has been trying to kill her daughter.
I know he did too much, y'all.
The detective investigating the murder of 20-year-old Shakia Smith has just been told by her mother that she thinks Moses Dial, Shakia's boyfriend, has been trying to kill her.
Moses called her that morning to explain that he and Shakia had an argument. She had jumped out of his car and gotten into a stranger's car, and now he couldn't find her.
Shakia's mother says she doesn't believe Moses' story.
Don't trust Moses.
You don't trust Moses?
And I made that known to the police from every incident they ever had.
Shakia's mom had told me that there was some kind of domestic dispute before.
They have a volatile relationship, not necessarily violent, but volatile.
And now she believes that Moses shot her daughter.
I know he did too much, y'all.
Shakia's cousin Kyla was already at the station as support for her mother, so the detective speaks with her next.
Let's talk about Shakia, okay? What did you know that she was doing or who she was going to be with last night?
Kyla had actually been staying at the same hotel that Moses and Shakia had been staying in, just in a separate room.
I know she was going out, and her boyfriend dropped her off there. The last time I heard from her was like 11:58, and then after that, I went to sleep.
Kyla woke around 7 in the morning with Moses pounding on the door of her room.
He explained that Shakia was missing. Same story that he told Shakia's mom and the 911 call taker.
What's going on?
Shakia.
But according to Kyla, Moses brought more than just the news of Shakia's disappearance.
Look, here's some of my stuff.
In his hands, he has Shakia's personal belongings, and he's given it to Kyla.
He basically said, okay, she left me. I don't know where she's at. Here's her stuff.
At this point in the interview, Kyla hesitates.
I don't want to incriminate nobody with nothing. I just know that I smelled bleach.
You smelled bleach?
Yeah.
But she didn't just smell it.
So you never actually saw like a bleach bottle?
I did see the bleach bottle, and he had a rag over it. I just looked over the balcony and saw him taking it out the car.
She was very clear that she was not trying to imply that he had done anything, but she wanted to let them know everything that she had witnessed.
Growing increasingly suspicious of Moses, the detective then turns to Charlene James, Shakia's friend who'd spoken to officers at the crime scene.
So you and Shakia, you're best friends, right?
We real close.
Mm-hmm.
Charlene says she was on the phone with Moses the morning Shakia was shot.
It was like 5 o'clock in the morning. And I wanted them to come get me, her and her boyfriend.
Yeah, give me like 15 and I'll be here.
According to Charlene, the couple was not having a good night.
Shakia's friend told me that they had an argument.
Charlene could hear the whole thing.
They had an altercation. It was verbal, nothing physical.
But then the tone changed.
Right now, let me out.
Once they got to my side of town, that's when things like escalated. Because at that point, she wanted to leave.
Let me out the car.
Shakia asked to be let out of the car, and Moses abruptly ended the call.
Almost immediately, he calls her back and tells her that Shakia got out of the car.
Moses told her that Shakia had hopped out of the car and that she had actually got out of the car with her weapon and a bag of money.
She just jumped out the car and jumped in the car with somebody else.
Charlene says she'd never done that before.
They always be arguing, but it never got to this point where she hopped out the car.
She says that she absolutely believes that Shakia was intoxicated.
But getting in a stranger's car was dangerous.
Moses had reason to be concerned for his girlfriend.
She's carrying the tips that she made from the evening, so we're talking several $100s. Could that have been the motive for someone taking her life? Could it have been robbery?
The detective asks what kind of gun Shakia had, and Charlene says she's not sure.
It's a pink gun. Real pretty gun.
She doesn't know, she just knows that it's cute, it's pink, and it has little bullets.
The shell casings found at the scene were .22 caliber, and those are very small bullets. So now, detectives were thinking that maybe she was shot with her own gun.
But who pulled the trigger? The detective asks Charlene if she knows what Moses and Shakia were arguing about.
She found something in her phone.
He had seen a text message from a guy that she had cheated on him with.
Who is that?
Now that story is different than what Moses told the dispatcher.
Shortly before she was murdered, 20-year-old exotic dancer Shakia Smith had a major argument with her boyfriend, Moses Dial.
Their friend Charlene was actually on the phone when she heard them arguing, and then she heard Shakia say, "Let me out of the car."
No, pull the car over right now, let me out.
Charlene James tells the homicide detective that the argument was over Shakia cheating on Moses.
Shakia had been unfaithful in the past.
She had sex with another man while Moses was out of town.
Moses was under the impression that Shakia had actually stopped seeing this gentleman.
And they had moved on from it.
Who is that?
But that night, Moses found evidence that it wasn't all in the past.
According to Charlene, they had been arguing because Moses saw something in Shakia's phone.
Apparently, this text message was from that gentleman.
This the same person that she had intercourse with while her boyfriend was away.
Moses was completely blindsided.
That's the thing. He wanted it to stop, and she said it did.
Charlene speculates that she possibly ran into the guy at work.
I guess she seen him again at the club she was dancing at.
Shakia had hugged and possibly had kissed somebody in the parking lot.
Charlene didn't know that Shakia did anything with this guy that night. The text he sent her could have just been saying, "Hi," or "Good to see you again."
But Moses thought there was more to it than just some innocent messages.
Charlene says that Moses had actually confronted her about it and wanted Shakia to apologize.
Even tonight, he wouldn't get one. He wanted an apology.
Shakia is not trying to apologize, and instead she wants out of the car.
She was drunk. Let me out the car. You know when a person get caught doing something, they gonna be mad too.
Detectives need to speak to the one person who knows what really happened. Moses Dial. If they can find him.
Moses was last seen driving around, so investigators had asked Charlene if she knew what kind of car he drove. And she told them he was driving a Dodge Challenger.
With the focus on Moses, the detectives issued a be on the lookout for both him and his car, and they subpoenaed his phone records.
The police didn't receive a phone call from someone named Janelle.
Homicide.
Like Shakia, she's an exotic dancer.
So you and Shakia, you both work together?
Yeah, we're friends.
Janelle says that she was supposed to hang out with Shakia and Moses the night of the murder.
I ended up going to a party, and she was still at work, and he was supposed to be going to go get her and bringing her to where I was at.
She says they never showed up.
Janelle said the next morning she heard through a mutual friend that Shakia had been murdered.
And then around 11:45 a.m., Moses started texting her.
Moses didn't say anything in his messages about Shakia being dead. Janelle said that he was just texting her like it was just any other day.
She immediately blocked his number.
One of our mutual friends told me that 2 or 3 months ago, he said, like, he would kill her by bringing her.
It was a consensus between Shakia's family and friends that Moses had killed her.
Why would he do that?
Because I think it was because she cheated on him.
Detectives now consider Moses a fugitive suspect.
Detectives are convinced that Moses is on the run. They obtain a warrant for his arrest for murder.
When his subpoenaed phone records come in, they get a lead on his location.
Detectives are able to track Moses through his phone's GPS.
Moses is traveling north.
The investigators aren't sure where Moses is going, but he seems to be trying to get as far away from Georgia as possible.
By this point, Moses hadn't just left Beaufort or even Atlanta. He was completely outside the state of Georgia.
And the subpoena gives detectives more than just the phone's GPS data.
Investigators got access to Moses' phone records, which showed all the internet searches he had made.
His search history proves to detectives that they're on the right track.
Moses has searched several items of interest.
He searched what was the sentencing guidelines for felony murder.
We have the right person, the right suspect.
Detectives in Georgia have issued a warrant for the arrest of Moses Dial for the murder of his girlfriend, Shakia Smith.
Only hours after Shakia was gunned down and left dead in the street, Moses' cell phone GPS showed him fleeing the state.
They don't know exactly where he is going,
but it's clear from his phone's search history what he's running from.
On September 18th, he searched, "What is felony murder sentence in Georgia?"
The Gwinnett County Police reach out to the United States Marshals for assistance.
The police bring in the U.S. Marshals Fugitive Task Force to locate him and bring him in.
Within 2 weeks, the Marshals do just that.
The U.S. Marshals located him in Atlantic City, in New Jersey.
Put your hands where I can see you. Moses, stop!
Moses is arrested without incident.
Put your hands behind your head. Turn around.
The following day, we traveled to New Jersey to interview him.
Detectives asked Moses if he knows why he's being questioned.
Yes, ma'am.
Okay. Why?
Is it about my girlfriend, that situation?
He was very calm.
At that point, they confront Moses.
The detectives told Moses that they had audio and video from a home security camera in the neighborhood where Shakia was killed.
The electronic footage that we have of what happened, we're able to see your car pull into the neighborhood.
I told him that the incident was captured on a surveillance camera.
This is your opportunity to tell us the truth, okay?
I think he was shocked that she knew as much as she knew, and she just cornered him.
What are you thinking about?
Moses finally breaks down, and he tells detectives the whole night was just so crazy because she was just so drunk and irate.
He said he picked Shakia up from where she was working in Atlanta, and they traveled down towards Beaufort.
On the way, he got a text message.
As they were going to pick up Charlene, another exotic dancer reached out to him.
Hey, what are you even mad about?
And Shakia became angry. She was convinced that Moses was seeing the woman behind her back.
I was just like, baby, you need to chill out now. You need to stop. I understand you got a little jealousy when other females are around, but you got to understand that it's not like I'm trying to talk to these girls.
But he says Shakia refused to calm down.
We got into it, and it was crazy because she was drunk, and she started cursing me out.
He tells them that Shakia started hitting him while he was driving, trying to take the wheel.
Moses claims that she even shot her gun out the window.
She popped a few shots off while we was off the highway, and was like saying I'm a hoe and all this extra stuff, and things like that. Then after that, she tried to point the gun my way. I'm like, yo, you're drunk right now, you really need to chill out.
Moses stops his vehicle and is trying to have Shakia chill, calm down.
That's when she got out of the car and I said, yo, chill out. I said, what are you about to do? She said, she's gonna just hop in the next person's car.
Moses tells them that that's when it happened.
But Moses says he has no recollection of exactly how Shakia ended up dead.
Everything just happened so fast, to be honest with you. It's like I blacked out.
He was angry. They were arguing about one being unfaithful over the other, and they both got mad to the point where they got out of the car.
Hey, what are you doing? Huh?
I'm so done with you. Bye.
Get in the car.
Bye.
Get in the car. Yo, why you acting like this? Huh? How are you so done with me?
I moved on.
Moved on. Okay. Okay, so your feelings got involved? Huh? Just tell the truth. Just tell the truth. Tell the truth.
The detectives don't know why Moses killed Shakia.
What they are clear on is that they have a confession.
Who is that?
They were arguing, and even if it was with a split second in anger, he intended to kill her, period.
Moses Dial is charged with murder. And ultimately, the prosecutor decides to offer a plea deal.
I have seen 12 people, in the face of overwhelming evidence, come back with a not guilty. So I never bet on what a jury's going to do.
Moses takes the plea deal and he's sentenced to life with the chance of parole.
In Georgia, Moses must serve at minimum 30 years before he could even start the parole process.
And he must publicly accept responsibility for what he did.
If he wanted to have any kind of life at the end, he had to admit what he did and plead guilty. And he did.
Shakia's family and friends have gotten justice, but they've lost far more.
Shakia will be remembered as someone who brought joy and laughter into the life of the individuals that loved her, that supported her, and that were blessed to have her in their lives. Moses took it upon himself to take the life of someone who all she did was love him.
Shakia had her whole life ahead of her. She just had so much going for her, and all that was cut short that night.
The bottom line is no one deserves that, no matter who they are.
On the evening of August 8th, 1973, a routine homicide investigation began in Houston, Texas. Police officers were dispatched after receiving an unexpected confession from a young man named Elmer Wayne Henley Jr., who calmly told authorities that he had just killed a man named Dean Corll. At first, nothing about the call suggested that it would become one of the most consequential criminal investigations in American history. Officers arriving at the residence expected to examine a single shooting, determine whether it had been an act of self-defense, and collect the evidence necessary to explain one person's death. Instead, within hours, the investigation began to reveal a chain of events that would permanently alter the way law enforcement approached missing juvenile cases in the United States. Dean Corll lay dead from multiple gunshot wounds. The circumstances surrounding the shooting were unusual. But even more unusual was what Henley began telling detectives after he was taken into custody. He claimed that Corll had been responsible for the disappearances of numerous teenage boys over the previous several years. More astonishing still, he insisted that the bodies could be found if investigators were willing to follow him. Such claims naturally met with skepticism. Police officers regularly encountered suspects who exaggerated, lied, or attempted to redirect investigations for their own benefit. Yet Henley's account contained specific locations, descriptions, and details that could be verified. Detectives made the decision to investigate further. That decision would expose a crime unlike anything Houston had ever experienced. The first destination was a rented boat shed located on Silver Bell Street. From the outside, it appeared ordinary, blending into the surrounding neighborhood without attracting attention. Nothing about the modest structure suggested that it concealed evidence connected to one of the largest known serial murder cases in the history of the United States at that time. Investigators arrived with shovels and excavation equipment, uncertain whether they were pursuing a false confession or an unimaginable truth. Guided by Henley's directions, officers began digging into the ground beneath the shed. Before long, they encountered human remains. What initially appeared to be an isolated burial quickly became something far more disturbing. As excavation continued, additional bodies were discovered. Each new recovery transformed the investigation from a single homicide into a massive forensic operation. Detectives, crime scene personnel, and medical examiners realized they were no longer documenting one crime. They were uncovering the aftermath of years of violence that had remained hidden beneath ordinary ground while families searched for answers elsewhere. Over the days that followed, investigators expanded their searches beyond the boat shed. Other burial sites were identified at High Island, along the Bolivar Peninsula, in wooded areas near Sam Rayburn Reservoir, and at another location in Jefferson County. The discoveries confirmed that the killings had not been isolated incidents but part of a prolonged pattern extending from 1970 until August 1973. Ultimately, authorities attributed at least 29 murders to Dean Corll, with the victims consisting primarily of boys and young men between the ages of 13 and 20. Although some investigators later questioned whether the true number might have been higher, only those victims supported by recovered remains and corroborated evidence became part of the official count. Even today, the possibility of additional unidentified victims remains unresolved rather than established fact. As investigators worked through the excavation sites, another tragedy became increasingly clear. Many of the victims had disappeared months or even years earlier. Their families had reported them missing, searched neighborhoods, contacted friends, and hoped that one day their sons would return home. In numerous cases, authorities initially believed the missing teenagers had chosen to run away. During the early 1970s, this assumption was unfortunately common, particularly when older adolescents disappeared without immediate signs of violence. Limited investigative resources, combined with prevailing attitudes toward juvenile disappearances, often delayed extensive searches. Those delays created opportunities for a killer to continue operating without attracting the level of coordinated attention that such disappearances might receive today. Looking back, Investigators would later recognize that these early assumptions represented one of several factors that allowed the murders to continue over nearly 3 years. The victims came from different backgrounds, but many shared characteristics that made them vulnerable. Some were high school students. Others had left school or spent time away from home. Several were hitchhikers. Others were friends or acquaintances of 2 teenagers who would later become central figures in the investigation. David Owen Brooks and Elmer Wayne Henley Jr. Trust, rather than force, often became the first step in the crimes. Invitations to socialize, drink beer, smoke marijuana, attend informal gatherings, or simply accept a ride appeared harmless because they usually came through familiar faces. That familiarity reduced suspicion and made it easier for victims to enter situations from which they would never return. As the investigation progressed, authorities learned that Brooks and Henley had served as intermediaries, bringing young men to Coral under false pretenses. Both were teenagers themselves when they became involved. Brooks had known Coral since childhood and gradually developed a close relationship with him. According to later testimony and investigative findings, Coral provided Brooks with money, gifts, clothing, and even vehicles, creating a relationship built on manipulation and dependency. Henley entered Coral's circle later, around 1972. Initially intended to become one of Coral's victims, he instead became an accomplice after learning the truth about the murders. Investigators concluded that both young men participated in luring victims, though Coral remained the principal offender responsible for the abuse and killings themselves. Their eventual convictions would establish their legal responsibility for participating in the crimes, while Coral himself would never stand trial because he died before the investigation fully unfolded. Throughout the excavation process, forensic teams faced the painstaking task of recovering, documenting, and identifying every set of remains. Many bodies had been wrapped in plastic, covered with lime, and buried in relatively shallow graves. Identification depended upon dental records, missing person reports, and other forensic methods available at the time. Some victims could not be identified immediately, extending the anguish experienced by families who had already spent years living with uncertainty. In later years, advances in DNA technology helped resolve several outstanding identifications, demonstrating how scientific progress continued to influence a case long after the original investigation had ended. Beyond the physical evidence, detectives also faced the challenge of reconstructing nearly 3 years of criminal activity. Because the principal offender was dead, investigators relied heavily upon interviews with Brooks and Henley, physical evidence recovered from multiple locations, forensic examinations, and records connected to missing person investigations. Each discovery required careful verification. Investigators distinguished between evidence that could be directly supported and speculation that could not. This careful approach remains important today because the case has generated numerous rumors and unverified theories over the decades. While questions continue regarding whether additional victims may exist or whether Coral had any broader criminal associations, investigators have never established evidence sufficient to confirm such claims. The documented facts remain centered on the victims who were recovered, identified, and connected to Coral through forensic evidence and corroborated testimony. The significance of the Houston mass murders extends beyond the extraordinary number of victims. The case exposed weaknesses in how missing juvenile reports were evaluated during that period, highlighting the consequences of dismissing disappearances as voluntary runaways without sustained investigation. It also demonstrated the value of coordinated forensic work, meticulous excavation, and persistent investigative documentation in reconstructing crimes spanning multiple years. For the families involved, however, the case was never primarily about investigative milestones or criminal history. It was about sons, brothers, classmates, and friends whose disappearances had remained unexplained until August 1973. Each recovered victim represented not simply evidence in a criminal investigation, but the end of years of unanswered questions for people who had never stopped searching. as investigators continued their work during those remarkable days in August. One central question remained. Who was Dean Corll, the man whom many neighbors had known as a polite employee of a neighborhood candy company? And how had someone who appeared so ordinary managed to conceal years of violent crime in plain sight? Understanding that contradiction would become the next step in uncovering one of the most disturbing criminal cases in American history, while ensuring that the lives of the victims, not the notoriety of their killer, remained at the center of the story. Dean Arnold Corll was born on December 24, 1939, in Fort Wayne, Indiana. Long before his name became associated with one of the most devastating criminal investigations in American history, his life appeared from the outside largely unremarkable. His parents divorced while he was still a child, and in the years that followed, his family relocated several times before eventually settling in Houston, Texas. Like many children whose families experience separation and frequent moves, Corll grew up amid changing circumstances, but the available historical record provides little evidence that would have allowed those around him to foresee the crimes that investigators would later uncover. It is important to recognize that countless people experience difficult childhoods without committing acts of violence. The events that would eventually define Dean Corll's life cannot be explained by family instability alone, and investigators have never identified a single factor capable of accounting for his later actions. By the early 1960s, Houston was undergoing significant growth. The city's economy was expanding, neighborhoods were developing rapidly, and thousands of families were building new lives throughout the metropolitan area. It was within this environment that Corll's mother established a small confectionery business in 1964 known as the Corll Candy Company. Dean worked there extensively, helping with production and distribution. The business itself was modest rather than industrial in scale, serving the surrounding community and contributing to an image of ordinary, hardworking family life. For neighborhood residents, the candy company became the primary reason they knew Dean Corll. It was not uncommon for children to gather around local businesses, and Corll frequently handed out free candy to youngsters in the area. Over time, this routine earned him a nickname that would later become inseparable from discussions of the case: the Candy Man. At the time, however, the nickname carried no sinister meaning. To local families, it reflected nothing more than a familiar adult who appeared generous toward neighborhood children. The gesture seemed harmless, even kind, reinforcing an impression that Corll was approachable and trustworthy. Years later, after the investigation became public, many residents struggled to reconcile that seemingly ordinary public image with the crimes revealed by police. Neighbors who had interacted with Corll described him in remarkably consistent terms. They remembered a man who was polite in conversation, soft-spoken, neatly dressed, and generally courteous. Accounts from those who knew him casually did not portray someone who frequently argued with others or attracted attention through disruptive behavior. He did not fit the popular stereotype of a visibly dangerous individual. That contrast between public appearance and hidden criminal conduct became one of the most unsettling aspects of the Houston investigation. It served as a reminder that appearances alone rarely provide reliable insight into an individual's capacity for violence. Investigators, historians, and criminologists have often pointed to this contradiction not because it offers an explanation, but because it demonstrates how easily serious offenders can avoid suspicion when they outwardly conform to social expectations. Corll's employment at the family candy business also placed him in regular contact with young people living nearby. According to the evidence presented during the investigation, this familiarity helped create an environment in which he appeared safe and recognizable rather than threatening. Trust develops gradually within communities, often through repeated everyday interactions. Parents saw an adult associated with a local business. Teenagers saw someone they had encountered for years. In retrospect, investigators concluded that this ordinary public identity made it easier for Corll to establish connections that later became central to his crimes. The investigation did not suggest that handing out candy itself was criminal behavior. Rather, it demonstrated how an established reputation for friendliness could reduce suspicion when later interactions occurred. Understanding that distinction is important because it avoids attributing sinister intent to ordinary actions while recognizing how trust can be exploited by offenders. As the years passed, Coral developed relationships with local teenagers, among them David Owen Brooks. Brooks first met Coral when he was only 12 years old. Over time, their association became increasingly close. According to evidence presented after the murders were uncovered, Coral provided Brooks with gifts, money, clothing, and eventually even vehicles. These benefits created a relationship marked by dependency and influence. Investigators later concluded that Brooks became deeply involved in Coral's activities, ultimately helping to bring other young men into situations that proved fatal. While Brooks would later be convicted for his role in the crimes, investigators also recognized that his relationship with Coral had developed over several years, beginning when Brooks himself was still a child. This chronology became an important part of understanding how Coral gradually expanded his ability to target victims through trusted intermediaries rather than relying solely on direct contact. Another individual who would become central to the investigation was Elmer Wayne, Henley Jr. Unlike Brooks, Henley joined Coral's circle later, around 1972. According to investigative findings, Coral had originally intended to make Henley one of his victims. Instead, after Henley became aware of the murders, Coral chose to keep him alive and involve him in the offenses. Investigators concluded that Henley also participated in locating and bringing victims to Coral, receiving money in exchange. Both Brooks and Henley would eventually receive life sentences for their roles in the crimes. Yet neither young man's involvement changes the central finding reached by investigators. Dean Coral remained the principal offender responsible for the pattern of kidnappings, abuse, and killings that continued between 1970 and 1973. Looking back at Houston during the early 1970s also provides essential context for understanding how the crimes remained undiscovered for so long. The city was large, expanding rapidly, and home to many neighborhoods where teenagers enjoyed considerable independence compared with later generations. Young people frequently traveled without constant supervision, spent time with friends throughout the city, and sometimes stayed away from home for extended periods. At the same time, law enforcement agencies across the United States often approach reports of missing teenagers differently than they do today, particularly when adolescents had previously run away, associated with older friends, or were perceived as independent. Investigators sometimes believed they had left voluntarily and would eventually return. This assumption did not originate with the Coral case, nor was it unique to Houston. It reflected broader investigative practices of the period. In hindsight, however, those assumptions had tragic consequences. Several of Coral's victims were initially believed to have run away. Families reported disappearances, hoping for immediate action, yet the absence of obvious evidence pointing to foul play often slowed investigations. As months turned into years, uncertainty replaced urgency. Parents continued searching, siblings continued hoping, and friends gradually realized that familiar faces would not return to school, neighborhood gatherings, or family celebrations. Only after the excavation of the burial sites did many families finally receive answers they had sought for years. The documented victims shared no single background beyond their age and vulnerability. Many were high school students, others had left school or spent time away from home. Some accepted rides, others trusted invitations from people they already knew. According to investigative findings, Coral rarely relied on sudden violence in public places to encounter victims. Instead, familiarity and personal connections became the foundation upon which the crimes were built. Brooks or Henley often invited acquaintances to drink beer, smoke marijuana, attend informal gatherings, or simply spend time together. Because the invitations came from people the victims recognized, there was little immediate reason for suspicion. That pattern underscores a recurring lesson found in many criminal investigations. Trust, when deliberately manipulated, can become a powerful tool for offenders seeking to isolate victims without attracting attention. As detectives reconstructed events after August 1973, they concluded that this gradual exploitation of ordinary relationships explained, in part, how Coral avoided detection for nearly 3 years. There was no single dramatic moment announcing the beginning of the crimes. Instead, investigators identified a progression in which a man widely regarded as quiet and dependable built relationships, cultivated trust, and ultimately abused that trust in ways that remained hidden until his death. The contrast between public appearance and private conduct continues to make the Houston mass murders a significant case for criminologists and investigators. Not because it offers simple explanations, but because it illustrates the limitations of judging risk solely by outward demeanor. As the investigation moved beyond Coral's public life and into the chronology of the disappearances themselves, attention increasingly shifted away from the offender and toward the young people whose lives had been interrupted without explanation. Each missing person report represented more than a case file. It represented an empty bedroom, an unanswered telephone call, a family waiting for news, and a community gradually coming to understand that what had seemed like isolated disappearances were, in fact, connected chapters in a single, devastating series of crimes. The next stage of the story begins with those victims, whose disappearances would eventually reveal the full scale of the tragedy that had remained hidden beneath the surface of everyday life in Houston. The investigation into the Houston mass murders ultimately became a story measured not by the notoriety of the offender, but by the lives that were taken and the families left searching for answers. When detectives began reconstructing the timeline after August 1973, they found that the victims did not come from a single neighborhood, social group, or family background. They ranged in age from approximately 13 to 20 years old. Some were high school students with ordinary routines and close family ties. Others had left school early or spent increasing amounts of time away from home. A number occasionally hitchhiked or moved freely around Houston, a common practice for many teenagers during the early 1970s. Several knew David Owen Brooks or Elmer Wayne Henley Jr. personally, and it was often those existing friendships that made the invitations they received appear harmless. Rather than selecting strangers through random encounters, the offender frequently relied upon familiarity. That pattern became one of the defining characteristics of the case. Investigators concluded that trust, once established through friends or acquaintances, was repeatedly exploited to isolate victims without immediately raising suspicion. In hindsight, this method helps explain why so many disappearances initially appeared unrelated. Families saw individual tragedies unfolding weeks or months apart. Law enforcement received separate missing person reports with little evidence connecting one case to another. Only after the discoveries in August 1973 did investigators recognize that many of these disappearances were chapters in a single, continuous sequence of crimes spanning nearly 3 years. Among the earliest victims investigators were able to identify were Donald Waldrop, 15 years old, and his younger friend Jerry Waldrop, 13. Their disappearance would later stand as one of the earliest documented points in the official timeline of the murders. Investigators concluded that the two boys vanished on September 25, 1970, after going to meet Dean Coral. Like many families confronted with the sudden disappearance of a child, their relatives searched for explanations that made sense. They contacted authorities and hoped for immediate assistance. Yet, according to the investigative record, police at the time believed the boys had likely run away. Such conclusions reflected investigative practices common during that era rather than specific evidence proving the boys had chosen to leave voluntarily. Unfortunately, that assumption delayed the possibility of recognizing a much larger pattern. Nearly 3 years later, After Henley's confession led investigators to the Silver Bell Road boat shed. The remains of Donald and Jerry were among those recovered. For their families, the discovery ended years of uncertainty while introducing a different kind of grief. The hope that missing children might someday return home was replaced by the certainty that they never would. Their case became a painful example of how missing person investigations could stall when early assumptions proved incorrect. As detectives examined additional reports, more names emerged from the growing list of victims. James Glass, 14 years old, was identified among those whose lives had ended during the 3-year period under investigation. Billy Ridinger, 19, also appeared on the official victim list, reminding investigators that the offender did not limit his victims to younger adolescents alone. Frank Aguirre, 18, Charles Cobble, 17, Richard Hembry, 13, Ralph Holmes, 19, Billy Balch, 17, and Mark Scott, 17, were among the other victims whose identities eventually became known through the investigation and subsequent forensic work. Although each young man had his own family, friends, ambitions, and daily routines, the available evidence showed that they had all encountered the same fatal deception. Some accepted invitations from people they trusted. Others were persuaded by offers that appeared ordinary enough to require little hesitation. Looking back decades later, investigators emphasized that there was nothing unusual about teenagers accepting invitations from acquaintances during that period. Such behavior reflected normal social interactions rather than recklessness. The responsibility for what followed rested entirely with those who planned and carried out the crimes. Throughout the investigation, detectives worked carefully to establish verified identities for every set of remains they recovered. This process demanded patience and precision. The condition of the burial sites meant that immediate identification was not always possible. Medical examiners relied upon dental records, missing person files, physical characteristics, and other forensic methods available at the time. Families who had already endured years of uncertainty were often forced to wait even longer while specialists attempted to match evidence with existing records. In several instances, definitive identification required advances in forensic science that became available only years after the original investigation. DNA analysis, developed long after the murders themselves, eventually helped confirm the identities of victims whose names could not initially be established with certainty. These later identifications demonstrated that criminal investigations sometimes continue long after courtroom proceedings have ended, as science provides new opportunities to answer questions left unresolved by earlier technology. Every confirmed identification represented more than the completion of a forensic task. It allowed families to replace uncertainty with documented truth. However painful that truth might be, during the reconstruction of events, investigators also noticed recurring circumstances surrounding many disappearances. Numerous victims had accepted invitations to spend time with Brooks or Henley because they already knew them personally. The offers themselves appeared ordinary. They might involve drinking beer, smoking marijuana, attending an informal gathering, or simply riding somewhere together. Nothing in those invitations necessarily suggested immediate danger. The victims were not disappearing after being seized by strangers in highly public settings. Instead, they vanished after entering situations that seemed familiar and routine. This distinction became critically important for understanding why so many disappearances initially failed to generate widespread alarm. Friends often assumed the missing teenager had simply decided to stay elsewhere. Parents hoped their sons would return after a few days. Investigators, lacking evidence of violence, sometimes viewed the cases as possible runaways. While these assumptions reflected the investigative environment of the early 1970s, they also created opportunities for the crimes to continue without immediate detection. The families affected by these disappearances shared a common experience despite coming from different neighborhoods and backgrounds. Days gradually turned into weeks. Weeks became months. Birthdays passed without celebration. School years ended with empty desks that remained permanently unoccupied. Holidays arrived carrying unanswered questions instead of reunions. Every unexpected telephone call offered a brief moment of hope before disappointment returned. In many cases, parents continued believing that their sons might someday walk through the front door, unaware that investigators would eventually discover they had died years earlier. One of the enduring lessons of the Houston investigation is the emotional burden carried by families of missing persons. Unlike cases in which death is immediately confirmed, disappearances often leave relatives suspended between hope and despair. That uncertainty can persist for years, affecting every aspect of family life. The recovery of remains brings certainty, but it also marks the end of hope. The Houston mass murders forced dozens of families through both stages, first enduring unexplained disappearances and later confronting confirmation that their loved ones had become victims of a serial offender. As detectives continued assembling timelines, interviewing witnesses, and examining physical evidence, another troubling realization emerged. Many victims had disappeared without anyone recognizing that their cases might be connected. Houston was a large and rapidly growing city, and individual missing person reports were often handled separately. Without the confession that followed Coral's death, investigators might never have discovered the relationship between those disappearances. The excavation of the burial sites transformed isolated case files into a single investigation, allowing detectives to reconstruct a pattern that had remained hidden beneath ordinary daily life. This reconstruction depended not only upon forensic evidence, but also upon the cooperation of Brooks and Henley after Coral's death. Their statements, when supported by physical evidence, enabled investigators to place victims within a broader chronology. Even so, detectives remained careful to distinguish between information supported by evidence and claims that could not be independently verified. That disciplined approach became essential because of the extraordinary scale of the investigation and the public attention it received. Despite the extensive work completed in 1973 and the years that followed, questions remained. Some victims required later identification. Investigators acknowledged that additional victims might have existed, but they also emphasized that such possibilities could not be treated as established fact without supporting evidence. This distinction remains important in any historical examination of the case. The documented record is built upon recovered remains, forensic analysis, corroborated testimony, and carefully verified investigative findings rather than speculation. By the time investigators had identified many of the young men whose disappearances formed the heart of the case, the scale of the tragedy had become undeniable. Yet understanding who the victims were represented only one part of the investigation. Detectives also needed to determine precisely how the crimes had been carried out, how two teenage accomplices became involved, and how the offender maintained control over victims while avoiding detection for nearly 3 years. Those questions would become the focus of the next phase of the investigation, as evidence recovered from the crime scenes and testimony provided by those directly involved allowed authorities to reconstruct the methods behind one of the most disturbing serial murder cases in American criminal history. As investigators continued assembling the chronology of the Houston mass murders, one question became increasingly important. How had a single offender managed to encounter so many victims over nearly 3 years without immediately attracting suspicion? The answer did not lie in elaborate disguises or sophisticated criminal networks. Instead, the evidence pointed toward a combination of carefully cultivated trust, manipulation, and the involvement of two teenage accomplices whose relationships with Dean Coral became central to the investigation. Reconstructing those relationships helped detectives understand not only how the victims were approached, but also why so many accepted invitations that, on the surface, appeared entirely ordinary. David Owen Brooks was the first of those two young men to enter Coral's life. According to the investigation, Brooks met Coral when he was approximately 12 years old. What began as an acquaintance gradually developed into a close relationship over several years. Investigators learned that Coral provided Brooks with money, gifts, clothing, and eventually even a vehicle. Such generosity created a dynamic in which Brooks became increasingly dependent upon an older adult, who exercised considerable influence over him. During later court proceedings and interviews, Brooks acknowledged receiving compensation in exchange for bringing other teenage boys to Coral. According to the evidence presented during the investigation, that compensation sometimes amounted to around $200 or, in certain instances, valuable gifts such as a vehicle. Detectives viewed these payments as an important element in understanding Brooks' participation. Rather than random acts of assistance, they demonstrated a pattern in which Coral rewarded behavior that advanced his crimes. Years later, investigators and prosecutors would distinguish carefully between recognizing the manipulative nature of this relationship and acknowledging Brooks' own criminal responsibility. Brooks was ultimately convicted and sentenced to life imprisonment for his role in the murders. Understanding how Coral influenced him did not lessen the seriousness of his participation, but it did help explain the gradual process through which an adolescent became involved in crimes of extraordinary magnitude. Elmer Wayne Henley Jr. entered the picture later, around 1972. His relationship with Coral followed a different path. According to the investigative findings contained in the official record, Coral originally intended for Henley to become one of his victims. Instead, after Henley became aware of the murders, Coral chose to spare his life and involve him in the crimes. Investigators concluded that Henley, like Brooks, received money in exchange for bringing young men to Coral. Henley later admitted that he had directly participated in locating victims, although he maintained that Coral himself committed the abuse and killings. The distinction became significant during the investigation because detectives sought to establish the precise role played by each individual. Physical evidence, witness statements, and later court proceedings consistently identified Coral as the principal offender while recognizing Brooks and Henley as accomplices whose actions contributed directly to the crimes. Understanding these relationships was essential because neither Brooks nor Henley simply encountered victims by chance. Instead, they often approached people they already knew. Friends invited friends. Acquaintances contacted classmates. Familiar faces extended invitations that appeared entirely routine within the social environment of early 1970s Houston. According to the evidence gathered by investigators, common invitations involved drinking beer, smoking marijuana, attending informal gatherings, or simply spending time together. Sometimes the invitation was nothing more than an offer of transportation. None of these situations, standing alone, necessarily suggested danger. Teenagers frequently spent time with friends without informing their parents of every destination, and accepting a ride from someone familiar rarely seemed unusual. The investigation demonstrated that Coral deliberately relied upon these ordinary social interactions rather than overt force during the initial stages of the crimes. By exploiting existing friendships, he significantly reduced the likelihood that victims would recognize immediate danger before arriving at his residence. Detectives concluded that Coral rarely depended upon public abductions or sudden attacks in crowded locations. Instead, the available evidence indicated that victims generally arrived voluntarily, believing they were visiting someone they knew through Brooks or Henley. This distinction proved crucial in explaining why disappearances initially appeared unrelated. There were often no eyewitnesses reporting a violent confrontation, no immediate evidence of kidnapping in public view, and no obvious reason for alarm until the victim failed to return home. Once a victim arrived, however, the situation changed dramatically. According to testimony provided during the investigation and corroborated by physical evidence, Coral employed several methods to gain control. In some instances, victims were offered alcohol, and investigators also found evidence suggesting that sedatives may have been used in certain cases, although not every victim was incapacitated in this manner. More consistently documented was a deceptive tactic involving handcuffs. According to Brooks and Henley, Coral sometimes presented the handcuffs as part of a supposed demonstration or trick, inviting the victim to see how easily they could escape. A handcuff would first be secured to one wrist, followed by a request to extend the other hand. Once both wrists were restrained, the deception ended. At that point, according to the investigation, Coral produced a firearm or otherwise asserted physical control, leaving the victim with little opportunity to resist. Investigators emphasized that the effectiveness of this method depended upon surprise and trust. Rather than extraordinary physical strength, it reflected deliberate planning rather than impulsive violence. Another important piece of evidence recovered during the investigation was a large wooden board that became widely known as the torture board. Detectives described it as a substantial wooden structure fitted with metal restraints designed to immobilize victims. Testimony from Brooks and Henley, together with physical evidence recovered during the investigation, indicated that victims were often restrained on this board or on a bed after arriving at Coral's residence. The investigation documented repeated acts of prolonged physical assault and sexual assault committed by Coral against his victims. Medical examinations of recovered remains revealed injuries consistent with severe abuse prior to death. Rather than presenting these findings for sensational effect, prosecutors and investigators regarded them as critical forensic evidence demonstrating the extent of the violence involved. The documented injuries included multiple fractures, bruising, and other signs indicating that many victims suffered significant physical trauma before they were killed. According to the evidence, the murders themselves were carried out primarily through strangulation or the use of a .22 caliber firearm. Investigators found no indication that Coral relied upon a single method in every case. Instead, the available evidence showed variation across different victims while consistently indicating that the killings occurred only after the victims had been completely restrained and deprived of any realistic chance of escape. Once the murders had been committed, attention turned toward concealing the crimes. Although the full reconstruction of the burial sites would occupy investigators during later stages of the case, evidence showed that Coral took deliberate steps to hide the bodies by wrapping many in plastic, covering them with lime, and burying them in relatively shallow graves at multiple locations. This practice allowed the crimes to remain undiscovered far longer than might otherwise have been possible. Throughout the investigation, detectives remained careful to distinguish between facts supported by evidence and assumptions unsupported by the record. Popular discussion of the case has occasionally introduced speculation about additional methods, unknown associates, or broader conspiracies. However, investigators consistently focused on what could be demonstrated through physical evidence, corroborated testimony, and forensic examination. That disciplined approach became particularly important because Coral himself was dead before the investigation unfolded, leaving detectives unable to question the principal offender directly. Every conclusion, therefore, required careful comparison of witness statements against independently verified evidence. The involvement of Brooks and Henley also raised broader questions about manipulation, influence, and criminal responsibility. Investigators recognized that both young men had entered Coral's life while still adolescents, and that Coral had exercised considerable influence over them through money, gifts, and personal attention. At the same time, prosecutors argued successfully that both had knowingly participated in bringing victims to Coral despite becoming aware of the deadly consequences. The resulting convictions reflected the court's determination that manipulation did not eliminate personal accountability for criminal acts. As detectives reconstructed these methods, a clearer picture emerged of why the murders had continued for nearly 3 years without immediate detection. Familiarity replaced force during the initial contact. Deception replaced open confrontation. Trust became the mechanism through which victims were isolated. Only after Coral had secured complete control did violence begin. Understanding this progression helped investigators explain not only how the crimes occurred but Also why so many families initially believed their missing sons might simply return home. The absence of obvious public violence delayed recognition of a serial pattern, allowing individual disappearances to remain separate until August 1973 brought the investigation together. By the time detectives completed this stage of their reconstruction, they had established not only who many of the victims were, but also the methods through which they had been approached, restrained, and ultimately killed. Yet one crucial question still remained unanswered. How had these crimes continued over such an extended period? And how had the offender concealed their evidence across multiple locations until the final confrontation that abruptly brought the entire sequence of murders to an end? Between September 1970 and August 1973, the pattern reconstructed by investigators revealed not a series of isolated crimes, but a sustained sequence of disappearances that unfolded across the Houston area over nearly 3 years. At the time, no one outside the small circle surrounding Dean Corll understood that these individual cases were connected. Families searched independently. Friends wondered why familiar faces had suddenly vanished. Police departments received separate missing person reports that appeared to describe unrelated events rather than a single, coordinated pattern of violence. Only after Corll's death and Elmer Wayne Henley's cooperation with investigators did those scattered cases begin to form a coherent chronology. Looking back, detectives concluded that the greatest strength of the offender's method was not sophistication in the traditional sense, but the ability to blend repeated criminal acts into the ordinary rhythm of daily life. Houston in the early 1970s was a rapidly expanding city, and teenagers often moved freely between neighborhoods, schools, and friends' homes. Within that environment, a young person spending an evening with acquaintances or accepting a ride from someone familiar rarely appeared unusual. According to the investigation, Corll exploited precisely those ordinary social patterns. The first documented murders attributed to Corll occurred in late September 1970 with the disappearances of Donald Waldrop, 15, and Jerry Waldrop, 13. Their disappearance did not immediately generate evidence pointing toward homicide. Like several other families during that period, their relatives reported them missing and hoped they would be found alive. Investigators at the time believed the boys had likely run away, an assumption that reflected broader law enforcement practices of the era rather than evidence proving that conclusion. In retrospect, detectives recognized that this early assessment delayed the possibility of identifying a larger pattern. The boys' remains would not be recovered until nearly 3 years later, after Henley directed police to the burial site. Their case became the earliest confirmed point in what investigators would eventually establish as a prolonged sequence of murders. As months passed, additional young men disappeared. Individually, each case presented uncertainty rather than obvious evidence of a serial offender. Some victims had accepted invitations from friends. Others were known to spend time away from home. Several had connections to David Brooks or, later, Elmer Wayne Henley Jr., because the victims came from different backgrounds and disappeared at different times. There appeared to be little reason to suspect that a single individual stood behind every case. Families experienced each disappearance as a deeply personal crisis, while investigators lacked the information necessary to connect them. This separation of cases became one of the principal reasons the murders continued for so long. Without detection, modern investigations often benefit from centralized databases, rapid information sharing, and advances in forensic science, but such resources were far more limited during the early 1970s. As a result, patterns that might now be recognized more quickly remained hidden. According to the evidence gathered after August 1973, Corll's methods changed very little throughout the 3-year period. Victims were generally approached through existing relationships rather than random public encounters. Brooks and later Henley invited acquaintances to spend time together, drink beer, smoke marijuana, or simply socialize. Those invitations appeared routine, particularly because they came from familiar individuals rather than strangers. Investigators found no evidence suggesting that Coral relied primarily on violent public abductions. Instead, trust served as the initial gateway into situations where victims became isolated from family and friends. Once inside Coral's residence, detectives concluded the carefully planned methods described during the investigation were used to restrain and ultimately kill the victims. While the crimes themselves followed a broadly consistent pattern, the disposal of the victims' bodies evolved as time passed. The largest concentration of burials was eventually discovered at a rented boat shed on Silver Bell Road. Following Henley's directions, investigators excavated the site and recovered the remains of 17 victims buried beneath the floor and surrounding ground. The discovery transformed what had begun as a homicide investigation into one of the largest forensic recovery operations in the country's history at that time. Detectives soon realized that the boat shed represented only one location among several used to conceal evidence. As the investigation expanded, Henley directed officers to additional burial sites outside Houston. At High Island, along the Bolivar Peninsula, investigators recovered more victims buried in isolated coastal ground. Another search led authorities to wooded areas near Sam Rayburn Reservoir, where further remains were located. Evidence also connected the investigation to a burial site in Jefferson County. Each new excavation required careful forensic documentation before remains could be removed and examined. Investigators approached every site methodically, recognizing that each grave contained evidence essential not only for criminal prosecution, but also for identifying victims whose families had waited years for answers. The condition of the burial sites reflected deliberate efforts to conceal the crimes. According to the investigation, many bodies had been wrapped in plastic before burial. Lime had been spread over numerous graves, and the remains were generally buried in relatively shallow locations. These measures delayed discovery but did not prevent it. Once investigators understood where to search, they systematically recovered evidence from every identified site. The work demanded patience, precision, and considerable emotional resilience. Every excavation represented another family likely to receive devastating news. For forensic personnel, the process was not merely technical. Each recovery marked the conclusion of one missing person case, while simultaneously expanding the scale of the larger investigation. Identifying the victims became an equally demanding task. Some remains could be matched through dental records and existing missing person reports relatively quickly. Others required considerably more time because available records were incomplete or the condition of the remains complicated immediate identification. Years after the original investigation, advances in DNA technology allowed authorities to confirm the identities of several victims whose names had remained uncertain. These later developments illustrated how forensic science continued contributing to the case decades after the murders themselves had ended. Throughout this period, investigators remained careful to distinguish between confirmed evidence and unanswered questions. Although some investigators privately wondered whether additional victims might exist beyond the 29 officially attributed to Coral, no definitive evidence established a higher number. As a result, the official record continues to identify at least 29 confirmed victims, while acknowledging that speculation about additional cases has never been conclusively proven. This distinction remains important because the historical record depends upon evidence rather than assumption. Public discussion has occasionally suggested broader conspiracies or additional criminal associates beyond Brooks and Henley, but investigators have consistently stated that no evidence established Coral as part of a larger organized network involved in these crimes. Maintaining that distinction preserves the integrity of the documented investigation. As detectives reconstructed nearly 3 years of disappearances, they also reconsidered the investigative environment that had existed before August 1973. Many of the victims had initially been regarded as possible runaways because they were teenagers who enjoyed a degree of independence common for the period. without witnesses reporting abductions or physical evidence indicating immediate violence. Missing person investigations often proceeded cautiously. Looking back after the case was solved, investigators acknowledged that these assumptions unintentionally created opportunities for the offender to continue operating. The Houston mass murders became one of several cases that encouraged broader discussions within law enforcement about how reports involving missing juveniles should be evaluated. Rather than dismissing disappearances solely because a young person might have left voluntarily in the past, investigators increasingly recognize the importance of considering the possibility of foul play at an earlier stage. For the families affected by these crimes, however, institutional lessons came only after years of uncertainty. During the period between each disappearance and the eventual discoveries in August 1973, parents continued searching for sons who never returned home. Friends graduated from school, while classmates remained missing. Bedrooms were left untouched in the hope that one day they might again be occupied. Every unidentified set of remains recovered from the burial sites represented not only a forensic challenge but also the end of prolonged uncertainty for another family. The emotional impact of those discoveries extended far beyond the boundaries of the crime scenes themselves. By the summer of 1973, the sequence of murders had continued for nearly 3 years without public recognition of its full scope. Yet the pattern was about to end abruptly, not because investigators had identified the offender through conventional detective work, but because events inside Coral's residence took an unexpected turn. On the night of August 8, 1973, a confrontation involving Elmer Wayne Henley Jr., Rhonda Williams, Tim Curley, and Dean Coral would bring the murders to an immediate conclusion. That single encounter not only ended Coral's life, but also opened the door to an investigation that finally revealed the hidden history of disappearances that had haunted families across Houston for years. By the evening of August 8, 1973, nearly 3 years had passed since the first documented murders attributed to Dean Coral. Throughout that period, the pattern of disappearances had remained concealed behind separate missing person reports, scattered investigations, and the assumption that many of the missing teenagers had simply left home voluntarily. None of the families searching for their sons could have known that the events unfolding on that August night would abruptly end the series of murders and expose one of the largest criminal investigations in the history of Texas. Unlike the previous encounters reconstructed by detectives, the final confrontation did not unfold according to Coral's plans. Instead, a sequence of unexpected decisions and rapidly changing circumstances led to the death of the principal offender at the hands of one of his own accomplices. According to the investigative record, Elmer Wayne Henley Jr. arrived at Coral's residence that evening accompanied by 2 other young people, Tim Curley and Rhonda Williams. Williams was a young woman, making her presence unusual in light of the pattern investigators had documented throughout the case. The available evidence indicated that Coral had consistently targeted male victims during the preceding years. Detectives later concluded that the arrival of Williams altered the circumstances inside the house in ways that neither Coral nor Henley had anticipated. Rather than accepting the unexpected visitors, Coral became angry. Investigators determined that Coral decided all 3 individuals, Henley, Curley, and Williams, would have to be killed. According to Henley's later statements, Coral believed that allowing any of them to leave created an unacceptable risk that his crimes would eventually be exposed. Whether driven by suspicion, anger, or fear of discovery, the decision marked a turning point unlike any investigators had previously reconstructed. For the first time, one of Coral's longtime accomplices found himself facing the same deadly threat that earlier victims had unknowingly encountered. During the subsequent investigation, detectives compared Henley's account with the physical evidence recovered from the residence. They concluded that Coral succeeded in restraining the 3 occupants. As in previous crimes described by investigators, restraints became an important element of the situation. Henley later explained that Coral intended to kill everyone present in the house. Facing the immediate possibility of death, Henley attempted to convince Coral that he remained loyal and could assist in controlling the other two captives. According to the investigative findings, Henley persuaded Coral that he would be more useful if his restraints were removed. Detectives later regarded this conversation as the critical moment upon which the outcome of the entire case depended. Had Coral refused, investigators might never have uncovered the burial sites, and the disappearances could have remained unresolved for an unknown period of time. Coral accepted Henley's request and released him from the restraints, believing that Henley would help maintain control over the others. Coral allowed his accomplice to move freely inside the room. What happened next unfolded within moments. Once released, Henley seized a .22 caliber firearm. As Coral moved toward him, Henley fired multiple shots. The bullets struck Coral, who collapsed from his injuries. He died at the scene before emergency assistance could save him. The shooting immediately ended the sequence of murders that investigators would later attribute to Coral, although the event itself became the subject of careful scrutiny during the investigation. Authorities ultimately concluded that Henley had acted in self-defense. Based upon the physical evidence, witness statements, and the circumstances described during the investigation, detectives determined that Coral had been preparing to kill Henley, Tim Curley, and Rhonda Williams. Henley's decision to shoot Coral therefore occurred while facing an immediate threat to his own life and the lives of the other captives. That legal conclusion did not erase Henley's earlier role in the crimes. Investigators continued to hold him criminally responsible for his participation in numerous kidnappings and murders committed before that night. Nevertheless, the shooting itself was not treated as an unlawful homicide. Instead, it became the event that unexpectedly brought one of the nation's largest serial murder investigations to light. In the minutes following the shooting, Henley made a decision that fundamentally altered the course of the investigation. Rather than fleeing the scene, he contacted police. According to the investigative record, his initial statement was direct: "I just killed Dean." Officers responding to the call believed they were investigating a single shooting. There was no immediate reason to suspect that the incident would expand into a case involving dozens of victims. Upon arriving at the residence, officers secured the scene, confirmed that Coral was dead, and began questioning Henley about what had occurred. At first, detectives approached the case as they would any homicide investigation. The shooting itself appeared unusual, but not unprecedented. It was during the subsequent interviews that the investigation changed dramatically. Henley began providing information that far exceeded anything officers had anticipated. He described years of murders committed by Coral and claimed he could identify burial locations where the victims had been hidden. Initially, investigators reacted with understandable skepticism. Police officers frequently encounter individuals who exaggerate, fabricate stories, or attempt to redirect investigations. Extraordinary claims require extraordinary verification, and detectives recognized that nothing in Henley's account could be accepted without independent evidence. Yet his descriptions included specific locations, methods, and details that investigators could test. Rather than dismissing his statements outright, they decided to follow the evidence wherever it led. During questioning, Henley reportedly told investigators that if they wanted to know where the bodies were buried, he would show them. That statement became one of the defining moments of the investigation. It transformed the focus of the case from explaining a single shooting into determining whether years of unexplained disappearances might finally have an answer. Detectives organized teams to examine the locations identified during the interviews. The first destination would become the rented boat shed on Silver Bell Road. At that point, however, investigators still had no certainty regarding what they would find. They knew only that a young man who had admitted participating in serious crimes was directing them toward a location where he insisted human remains had been concealed. The following day, officers, forensic personnel, and medical investigators assembled at the boat shed. Guided by Henley's directions, They began excavating beneath the structure. Before long, the first human remains appeared beneath the soil. That discovery confirmed that Henley's extraordinary account had not been a fabrication. As excavation continued, additional bodies were recovered from the same site. What officers had initially believed might involve a single hidden grave rapidly expanded into one of the largest forensic recovery operations ever conducted in Texas. Detectives immediately realized they were confronting a crime of unprecedented scale. Every new discovery reinforced the conclusion that the disappearances of numerous teenage boys over the previous 3 years had not been isolated incidents. They were connected through a single offender whose crimes had remained hidden until his own death. The work at the boat shed was only the beginning. During subsequent interviews, Henley identified additional burial locations, leading investigators to High Island, wooded areas near Sam Rayburn Reservoir, and another site in Jefferson County. Over the following days, forensic teams recovered victim after victim, each discovery adding another chapter to the history detectives were painstakingly reconstructing. For many families, those excavations ended years of uncertainty. Missing person reports that had remained unresolved were now connected to physical evidence, allowing investigators to identify victims and notify relatives who had spent months or years hoping for different news. The emotional weight carried by those notifications extended far beyond the investigative process itself. Parents who had never stopped searching finally learned what had happened to their sons, even though the answers arrived in the most devastating possible form. Looking back, investigators have often observed that the final confrontation on August 8, 1973, represented an extraordinary turning point not because of careful planning by law enforcement, but because the offender unexpectedly lost control over the very system of manipulation and intimidation that had protected him for years. The decision to release Henley from his restraints, believing he remained loyal, proved to be the single miscalculation that ended the murders. Within hours, the principal offender was dead. One accomplice had begun cooperating with investigators, and the first steps had been taken toward uncovering the hidden burial sites that would reveal the full scale of one of the darkest criminal cases in American history. The shooting ended the violence, but it also marked the beginning of a far more complex challenge. Detectives now faced the enormous task of recovering victims from multiple locations, identifying each individual through painstaking forensic work, and reconstructing nearly 3 years of crimes using physical evidence, witness testimony, and the statements of 2 accomplices. Only then could investigators begin providing the answers that families had sought for so long, while ensuring that the victims, not the offender, remained at the center of one of the most significant homicide investigations ever conducted in the United States. The days following Dean Corll's death became a race against time for investigators, forensic specialists, and medical examiners. What had begun as the investigation of a single fatal shooting rapidly evolved into one of the largest homicide inquiries ever undertaken in Texas. Every hour brought new discoveries, each one demanding careful documentation before the next step could begin. Detectives understood that the significance of the investigation extended far beyond determining who had committed the crimes. They now carried the responsibility of identifying victims, establishing an accurate chronology, preserving evidence for future prosecutions, and providing answers to families who had spent years searching for missing sons. The investigation required extraordinary coordination because every new burial site presented both a crime scene and a place where grieving families would eventually seek closure. The first major excavation at the Silver Bell Road boat shed immediately demonstrated the scale of the task ahead. Guided by Elmer Wayne Henley's directions, investigators recovered the remains of 17 victims buried beneath and around the property. The work proceeded methodically. Each grave was photographed, measured, and carefully excavated to preserve every possible piece of forensic evidence. Detectives understood that once remains were removed without proper documentation, valuable information regarding the sequence of events, burial methods, and victim identification could be permanently lost. Every recovery therefore followed established forensic procedures despite the emotional impact of the discoveries. Officers who had initially expected to investigate one homicide now found themselves standing at the center of an excavation unlike anything most had experienced during their careers. As the days progressed, Henley continued cooperating with investigators by identifying additional burial locations. Police teams expanded their operations beyond Houston to High Island along the Bolivar Peninsula, where more victims had been concealed. Additional searches followed near Sam Rayburn Reservoir, where investigators located further graves in wooded terrain. Another location in Jefferson County also became part of the investigation. Each site presented unique logistical challenges. Some required extensive searching before excavation could even begin. Others demanded careful transportation of forensic personnel and equipment into relatively isolated areas. Despite these practical difficulties, investigators maintained the same careful standards of documentation at every location. The consistency of those procedures would later prove essential during criminal prosecutions because every conclusion presented in court needed to be supported by properly collected evidence rather than assumption. Throughout the recovery process, forensic specialists observed recurring methods of concealment. Many victims had been wrapped in plastic before burial, while lime had been spread over numerous graves. The bodies had generally been placed in relatively shallow graves across several locations rather than concentrated entirely in one place. Detectives concluded that using multiple burial sites reduced the likelihood that all the crimes would be discovered simultaneously. Nevertheless, once Henley provided investigators with the relevant locations, those efforts at concealment ultimately failed. The systematic recovery of evidence allowed authorities to reconstruct a pattern extending across nearly 3 years. Every excavation strengthened the conclusion that the disappearances previously treated as isolated incidents were in fact connected through one offender and 2 accomplices. While excavation teams worked at the burial sites, another equally demanding effort unfolded inside forensic laboratories and medical examination facilities. Identifying the victims became one of the investigation's highest priorities. Families throughout Houston had reported sons missing over the preceding years, but uncertainty still surrounded many of the recovered remains. Medical examiners relied heavily upon dental records, physical characteristics, and existing missing person files to establish identities. This work required exceptional precision because every identification would eventually be communicated to families who had waited months or years for answers. Investigators recognized that mistakes in such circumstances would carry profound emotional and legal consequences. As identifications progressed, the official list of victims gradually expanded. Among those identified were Donald Waldrop, Jerry Waldrop, James Glass, Billy Ridinger, Frank Aguirre, Charles Cobble, Richard Hembry, Ralph Holmes, Billy Balch, Mark Scott, and numerous other teenage boys and young men whose disappearances had remained unresolved until August 1973. Each confirmed identity represented more than another entry in an investigative report. It restored a name to remains that had initially been anonymous and allowed families to move from uncertainty toward documented truth. Some identifications, however, could not be completed immediately. In those cases, investigators preserved every available record, understanding that future advances in forensic science might eventually provide answers unavailable during the original investigation. Decades later, DNA analysis would indeed assist authorities in confirming several identities that had remained uncertain after the initial excavations, demonstrating how scientific progress continued contributing to the case long after the murders themselves had ended. Parallel to the forensic work, detectives devoted substantial effort to interviewing both surviving accomplices. Because Dean Corll had died before he could be questioned or prosecuted, Reconstructing the crimes depended heavily upon statements provided by David Owen Brooks and Elmer Wayne. Henley Jr. investigators approached those interviews with caution. They understood that neither accomplice could simply be accepted at his word. Every statement required comparison against independently verified physical evidence. Whenever Brooks or Henley described a victim, a location, or a sequence of events, detectives sought corroboration through excavation findings, forensic examinations, or missing person records. This disciplined investigative approach became one of the defining strengths of the case. Rather than relying solely upon confessions, authorities constructed a body of evidence capable of standing independently in court. During these interviews, detectives established that Brooks had known Coral since childhood and had gradually become involved through years of manipulation, financial incentives, and gifts. Henley, by contrast, had entered Coral's circle later and eventually participated in bringing victims despite originally being intended as a victim himself. Although the circumstances leading each young man into Coral's influence differed, investigators concluded that both knowingly participated in crimes that resulted in numerous deaths. Their cooperation after Coral's death helped recover victims and clarify the chronology, but it did not eliminate their own criminal responsibility. That distinction remained central throughout the investigation and subsequent legal proceedings. Another significant challenge involved separating verified facts from speculation. The extraordinary nature of the Houston mass murders generated widespread public attention. And with that attention came rumors regarding additional victims, unidentified burial sites, and alleged criminal networks extending beyond the documented evidence. Detectives repeatedly emphasized the importance of distinguishing confirmed investigative findings from unsupported theories. While some investigators acknowledged the possibility that additional victims could exist beyond the 29 officially attributed to Coral, they also made clear that no conclusive evidence established a higher number. Similarly, despite speculation raised over subsequent decades, authorities found no evidence demonstrating that Coral belonged to a broader organization involved in trafficking or exploiting children. Maintaining these distinctions preserved the credibility of the investigation by ensuring that conclusions remain grounded in evidence rather than conjecture. As forensic work continued, the broader implications of the case also became increasingly apparent. Investigators reviewing the chronology recognized how frequently missing teenagers had initially been presumed to be runaways during the early 1970s. Although those assumptions reflected investigative practices common at the time, the Coral investigation demonstrated their limitations. Families who had reported disappearances often believed immediate action would follow. Yet, without clear evidence of violence, many cases did not receive the intensive resources that might have revealed connections sooner. The Houston investigation became an important reference point for later discussions regarding missing juvenile investigations, encouraging law enforcement agencies to reconsider how such reports should be evaluated and coordinated across jurisdictions. For the families, however, these institutional lessons could never erase the years already lost. Parents who had spent months distributing photographs or contacting friends eventually found themselves attending funerals instead of welcoming children home. Siblings grew into adulthood, carrying memories interrupted by unexplained disappearances. Communities looked back upon familiar neighborhoods with the painful knowledge that ordinary places had concealed extraordinary violence for years without detection. The investigation therefore served two purposes simultaneously. On one level, it sought to establish criminal responsibility through evidence interviews and forensic science. On another, it sought to restore identities to victims whose disappearances had left families suspended between hope and uncertainty. As detectives completed the enormous task of reconstructing nearly 3 years of crimes, attention gradually shifted toward the courtroom. Dean Coral himself would never face prosecution because he had died during the confrontation on August 8, 1973. Responsibility for presenting the evidence therefore centered upon the two surviving accomplices. David Owen Brooks and Elmer Wayne Henley Jr. prosecutors now face the challenge of translating one of the largest homicide investigations in American history into criminal cases capable of meeting the highest standards of proof. The painstaking work completed at every excavation site, every forensic laboratory, and every interview room would soon become the foundation upon which justice for the victims would be pursued. As the investigation moved from discovery and recovery into the legal phase, authorities faced the difficult task of transforming an overwhelming amount of evidence into criminal cases against the two surviving participants. David Owen Brooks and Elmer Wayne Henley Jr., the central figure in the crimes, Dean Corll, was already dead. He would never stand before a judge, hear the evidence presented against him, or receive a sentence for the murders investigators attributed to him. The responsibility of explaining what had happened therefore fell upon prosecutors, detectives, forensic specialists, and witnesses who had spent months reconstructing the events. Their challenge was not simply to prove that crimes had occurred, but to establish the individual roles of the people who remained alive and accountable. The legal proceedings surrounding Brooks and Henley reflected the complexity of a case in which one offender had directed the violence, while two younger accomplices had assisted him in bringing victims into danger. From the beginning, investigators recognized that the relationship between Corll and his accomplices required careful examination. Both Brooks and Henley had been teenagers when they became involved with him, and both had experienced Corll's influence through money, gifts, and personal attention. However, prosecutors argued that their participation went beyond passive association. According to the evidence gathered during the investigation, both young men knowingly assisted Corll by helping locate victims. Their actions enabled Corll to continue his crimes, and the courts ultimately held them responsible for their roles. The fact that Corll exercised influence over them became an important part of understanding how the crimes developed, but it did not remove the legal responsibility attached to their decisions. David Owen Brooks was the first of the two surviving accomplices to face the consequences of his involvement. Investigators had known Brooks for years as someone connected closely to Corll. Their relationship had begun when Brooks was only 12 years old, long before the murders became public. Over time, Corll had provided Brooks with money, gifts, and material support, creating a relationship in which the older man held significant influence. According to the investigation, Brooks eventually became involved in bringing other teenagers to Corll. During questioning, Brooks admitted aspects of his participation, and investigators used his statements alongside physical evidence recovered from burial sites and other locations. The prosecution's case against him relied on demonstrating that he had knowingly assisted Corll in activities that led to the deaths of multiple victims. The evidence showed that Brooks was not merely a witness who discovered the crimes after they occurred. He had played an active role in connecting victims with Corll. The court ultimately convicted Brooks for his participation in the murders and sentenced him to life imprisonment. His case became one example of the broader legal and moral questions raised by the investigation. How should responsibility be evaluated when a young accomplice has been influenced and manipulated by an older offender but still knowingly contributes to criminal acts? The courts answered by recognizing both the circumstances surrounding his involvement and the seriousness of his actions. Elmer Wayne Henley Jr. faced an equally significant legal process. His role became particularly complex because he was both an accomplice and the person whose actions exposed the crimes. Without Henley's decision to contact police after shooting Corll, investigators might not have discovered the burial sites for an unknown period of time. His cooperation directly led authorities to the victims and provided essential information about the crimes. At the same time, investigators established that Henley had participated in bringing victims to Corll before the final confrontation. The law therefore treated his cooperation after Corll's death separately from his earlier criminal involvement. Detectives and prosecutors recognized the importance of his information while maintaining that assistance after the fact did not erase responsibility for previous actions. During the legal proceedings, Henley's statements became a major source of information about Coral's methods, the involvement of the accomplices, and the locations where victims had been buried. However, prosecutors did not rely solely on his words. They presented physical evidence recovered from multiple crime scenes, forensic findings from examinations of victims, and additional testimony supporting the investigation's conclusions. This combination of evidence strengthened the prosecution's case by demonstrating that Henley's statements corresponded with independently verified facts. The trial proceedings attracted significant attention because of the extraordinary scale of the crimes and the number of victims involved. The public had followed the investigation from the moment the first remains were discovered at the Silver Bell Roadboat shed, and the courtroom became another stage where the full story was gradually presented. Yet despite the intense public interest, the legal process remained focused on evidence rather than emotion. Prosecutors were required to establish specific criminal acts, while defense arguments addressed questions of responsibility, influence, and the circumstances surrounding the defendant's involvement. The evidence presented during these proceedings painted a disturbing picture of how the crimes had been carried out over nearly 3 years. Investigators explained how victims had been approached through acquaintances, how Coral had gained control over them, and how Brooks and Henley had contributed to bringing them into his presence. The recovered physical evidence played a crucial role because it provided confirmation beyond the statements of the accomplices themselves. Burial locations, victim identifications, and forensic examinations created a documented connection between the missing person cases and the crimes attributed to Coral and his associates. One of the most significant aspects of the legal proceedings was the recognition that the victims needed to remain central to the narrative. The case involved shocking criminal acts, but behind every piece of evidence was a person whose life had been taken. Prosecutors presented the victims not simply as names on a list, but as young people with families, friends, and futures that had been taken away. The identification process had already restored many names to the recovered remains, allowing the legal proceedings to acknowledge the human impact behind the investigation. The families of the victims also carried the weight of the courtroom process. For many, the legal proceedings represented a painful continuation of a journey that had begun when their sons disappeared. They had spent years searching for answers, only to learn the devastating truth after the discovery of the burial sites. The trials could not restore what had been lost, but they provided a public record of responsibility and accountability. Throughout the proceedings, the absence of Dean Coral remained significant. Because he had died on August 8, 1973, the person investigators identified as the central figure in the crimes would never face trial. This created a unique situation in which much of the evidence against Coral had to be reconstructed through testimony, forensic findings, and the statements of Brooks and Henley. The investigation therefore depended heavily on the ability of authorities to establish facts. Without the traditional process of questioning the primary suspect in court, the Houston mass murders also influenced broader discussions about how authorities handled missing teenagers. The case demonstrated the dangers of assuming that every missing young person had simply chosen to leave home. While many teenagers do run away, investigators recognized that disappearance cases require careful evaluation, particularly when patterns begin to emerge across multiple reports. The tragedy in Houston became a powerful reminder that missing person investigations can involve serious criminal activity, even when initial circumstances appear ordinary. By the conclusion of the legal proceedings, both surviving accomplices had received life sentences. Brooks and Henley would spend the remainder of their lives within the Texas prison system, while Coral's death meant that the principal offender would never experience a courtroom judgment. The legal outcomes provided a measure of accountability, but they could not fully resolve the questions and pain left behind by the murders. Many families continued to carry the emotional consequences of losing their sons, and the Houston community continued to remember the young victims whose lives had been cut short. The conclusion of the trials did not mark the end of the story. The case continued to influence criminal investigations, forensic practices, and discussions about missing persons for decades afterward. The recovered evidence, the investigative methods used, and the lessons learned from the failures that allowed the crimes to continue became part of a broader examination of how law enforcement responds to patterns of disappearance and violence. The Houston mass murders remained a reminder that behind every investigation are individuals whose lives matter far beyond the circumstances of their deaths. The final chapter of the case would not be defined only by the crimes committed, but by the lasting impact on families, communities, and the continuing effort to understand how such a tragedy could occur. The conclusion of the legal proceedings did not bring a true ending to the Houston mass murders. While the convictions of David Owen Brooks and Elmer Wayne Henley Jr. established criminal accountability for the surviving participants, the wider impact of the case continued long after the courtroom proceedings ended. The investigation had revealed not only the actions of one offender and two accomplices, but also the devastating consequences of missed connections, delayed recognition, and the vulnerability of families searching for missing children. The case became a defining moment in the history of American criminal investigations because of the number of victims involved, the length of time the crimes remained hidden, and the difficult questions it raised about how disappearances were handled during that era. At the center of the aftermath were the victims themselves. Although the public attention surrounding the case often focused on Dean Corll and the shocking details of the investigation, authorities and families continued emphasizing that the true focus should remain on the young men whose lives were taken. At least 29 victims were officially attributed to Corll, with most identified through investigative work conducted after August 1973. Each victim had a name, a family, friendships, and a future that was permanently interrupted. The recovery process allowed many families to finally learn what had happened, but that knowledge came with an unbearable cost. For years, relatives had lived with uncertainty, hoping that their missing sons might return. The discovery of the burial sites replaced uncertainty with painful confirmation. The emotional consequences of that transition were profound. A missing child leaves a family trapped between hope and fear. Every phone call, every unexpected knock at the door, and every possible sighting can create the belief that a reunion might still happen. When investigators eventually confirmed that those hopes could no longer become reality, families faced a different kind of grief. They had answers, but those answers were devastating. The Houston investigation therefore represented both discovery and loss. It solved the mystery of numerous disappearances while simultaneously revealing a tragedy on a scale that few had imagined possible. The case also changed how many people viewed missing person investigations involving teenagers. During the early 1970s, it was not unusual for missing adolescents to be considered possible runaways, especially when there was no immediate evidence of violence. Young people sometimes left home voluntarily, and investigators had to consider that possibility. However, the Houston mass murders demonstrated the dangers of allowing that explanation to become the default assumption without examining broader circumstances. The victims in this case had disappeared over a long period, yet their cases were initially treated as separate events. Only after investigators connected the disappearances did the full pattern become visible. The tragedy encouraged greater awareness that missing person cases require careful attention even when the circumstances appear ordinary. Another lasting consequence of the case involved the role of forensic science. When investigators first recovered the remains in 1973, identification depended largely on methods available at the time, including dental records, physical characteristics, and missing person documentation. These techniques allowed many victims to be identified, but some cases remained unresolved for years. As forensic technology advanced, especially through DNA analysis, investigators gained new tools to answer questions that had remained open for decades. Several victim identities were eventually confirmed through later scientific developments, demonstrating that investigations can continue long after the original crime scenes have been closed. The Houston case became an example of how advances in forensic science can provide answers even after significant time has passed. The investigation also remained significant because of the unusual circumstances surrounding the offender's death. Dean Corll never experienced a trial, never faced cross-examination, and never received a formal sentence for the crimes attributed to him. His death on August 8, 1973, occurred before the full scope of the murders became known. As a result, the historical record of his crimes had to be reconstructed through physical evidence, statements from Brooks and Henley, and the work of investigators who examined the burial sites. This created a unique challenge. The person considered responsible for the largest portion of the crimes was absent from the legal process that followed. Detectives, therefore, had to rely on evidence that could independently demonstrate what had occurred, rather than depending on a confession from the offender himself. Over the years, many questions have continued to surround the case. One of the most persistent involves whether Corll may have had additional victims beyond the 29 officially confirmed. Some investigators and researchers have considered the possibility that the true number could have been higher, particularly because of the length of time he operated and the number of young people who disappeared during the period. However, no additional victims have been conclusively established. The official record remains based on verified evidence, recovered remains, and confirmed identifications. This distinction remains important because historical accuracy requires separating documented facts from speculation. Another question that has received attention is whether Corll was connected to a larger criminal organization. Over the years, various theories have suggested the possibility of broader involvement, but investigators have found no evidence proving that Corll was part of a larger network. The documented investigation identified Corll, Brooks, and Henley as the individuals responsible for the crimes. While the case generated many theories because of its disturbing nature, authorities have not confirmed claims beyond the evidence available. The focus of the investigation has therefore remained on the proven actions of those directly involved. The case also had a lasting impact on the community of Houston. A city that had unknowingly contained a hidden pattern of violence was forced to confront the reality that ordinary places and familiar relationships could conceal unimaginable crimes. The discovery of the burial sites shocked residents and changed public awareness about the importance of reporting and investigating missing persons. Communities across the country followed the case, and many people reconsidered how easily a person could disappear without immediate explanation. The story became part of broader discussions about child safety, missing person awareness, and the responsibilities of law enforcement agencies. Yet, even decades later, the most important aspect of the case remains the human cost. The victims were not defined by the circumstances of their deaths. They were sons, classmates, neighbors, and friends. Their identities represented individual lives rather than statistics. The investigation restored their names to the historical record, but it could not restore the years they would have lived or the experiences they would have shared with their families. Remembering them remains essential because criminal cases of this magnitude can sometimes become dominated by the actions of offenders rather than the people they harmed. The Houston mass murders are also a study of manipulation and control. Corll's ability to continue his crimes depended heavily on gaining trust and exploiting relationships. His use of Brooks and Henley demonstrated how influence and dependency could become tools of criminal behavior. The case showed that manipulation does not always appear immediately as coercion. It can develop gradually through gifts, attention, promises, and emotional control. Understanding this dynamic became an important part of how investigators and researchers examined the case afterward. The story of the accomplices also raised difficult questions about responsibility. Both Brooks and Henley were young when they became involved with Corll. Both were influenced by their relationship with him, yet both also made decisions that contributed to the crimes. Their convictions reflected the legal conclusion that participation in criminal acts carries consequences even when manipulation and pressure are present. The case, therefore, remains a complex example of how courts must consider both personal accountability and the circumstances that shape an individual's choices. More than 50 years after the murders ended, the Houston mass murders remain one of the most studied serial murder cases in American history. The investigation continues to be examined by law enforcement professionals, researchers, and historians because it illustrates both the effectiveness of determined investigative work and the consequences of missed warning signs. It demonstrates how evidence, persistence, and cooperation can uncover the truth even after years of uncertainty. At the same time, it reminds society of the importance of taking every missing person case seriously and ensuring that victims are never reduced to numbers. The legacy of the case is therefore not only the record of a criminal investigation, but also a reminder of the lives behind that investigation. Dean Corll became known because of the crimes he committed, but the lasting responsibility of remembering this case belongs to the victims and the families who endured unimaginable loss. Their stories remain the most important part of understanding the Houston mass murders, a tragedy that exposed the darkest possibilities of human behavior while also demonstrating the determination of those who worked to uncover the truth. The Houston mass murders remain one of the most disturbing criminal cases in American history, not only because of the number of victims, but because of the length of time the crimes continued while remaining hidden. Between 1970 and 1973, Dean Arnold Corll was able to create a pattern of violence that claimed the lives of at least 29 young men. The investigation that followed his death revealed a combination of manipulation, deception, and missed opportunities that allowed the crimes to continue for nearly 3 years. Yet beyond the shocking facts and the extensive investigation, the lasting importance of the case lies in the questions it raised about how society recognizes danger, how authorities respond to missing young people, and how victims are remembered after tragedy. The final understanding of the Houston mass murders was not created through a single discovery, but through the gradual collection of evidence, testimony, and the determination of investigators to uncover the truth. The beginning of the end came on August 8, 1973. When Dean Corll was killed by Elmer Wayne Henley Jr., the shooting itself was not initially recognized as the event that would expose one of the largest serial murder cases in American history. Police responding to Henley's call believed they were dealing with a single homicide. The investigation changed only after Henley began revealing information about Corll's crimes and directing authorities toward burial locations. What followed was an unprecedented recovery effort that uncovered the remains of dozens of victims and connected years of missing person cases to one offender. Without Henley's decision to cooperate, the truth behind many disappearances might have remained unknown for much longer. However, the discovery of the crimes did not erase the suffering that had already occurred. Families had spent years searching for sons who would never return. Friends had wondered why people they knew had suddenly vanished. Communities had continued daily life without knowing that a hidden series of murders was occurring. Nearby, the investigation provided answers, but those answers came after irreversible loss. The victims of the Houston mass murders were mostly teenagers and young men between 13 and 20 years old. They were students, friends, neighbors, and family members. They were not simply names connected to a criminal case. They were individuals whose lives had meaning beyond the circumstances of their deaths. The process of identifying them became one of the most important responsibilities of investigators, because restoring their names meant restoring their place in history. The work of forensic specialists allowed many families to finally know what had happened, ending years of uncertainty. But identification also carried an emotional burden because each confirmed victim represented another family receiving heartbreaking confirmation. The case also revealed the importance of understanding how offenders can operate through ordinary social connections. Corll did not primarily depend on random attacks against strangers. Instead, investigators found that he used relationships and familiarity to gain access to victims. Through David Owen Brooks and Elmer Wayne Henley Jr., he was able to approach young people who had reason to trust the individuals inviting them to spend time together. The invitations often appeared normal: visiting a friend's house, drinking beer, spending time socially, or accepting a ride. The danger was hidden behind circumstances that seemed familiar. This method allowed Coral to avoid immediate suspicion because the first moments of contact did not resemble a traditional kidnapping. The case demonstrated that criminal behavior can sometimes be concealed behind ordinary interactions, making awareness and careful attention especially important when dealing with vulnerable individuals. The role of Brooks and Henley remains one of the most complicated aspects of the case. Both became involved while still young, and both were influenced by Coral through money, gifts, and attention. Investigators recognized that Coral had manipulated them, but the courts also recognized that both men made decisions that contributed to the crimes. Their convictions reflected the principle that personal responsibility remains important even when manipulation is present. Their cooperation after Coral's death helped authorities recover victims and understand the crimes. But it did not erase their involvement. The legal outcomes represented an attempt to balance these complex realities, recognizing the influence Coral had over them while holding them accountable for their actions. Another significant legacy of the Houston mass murders was the impact on law enforcement practices. Before the case was uncovered, many missing teenagers were often viewed through the possibility that they had voluntarily left home. While that explanation could sometimes be correct, the Houston investigation demonstrated the danger of relying on it without examining broader patterns. Multiple disappearances occurring over time may appear unrelated when viewed individually, but they can reveal a larger pattern when information is shared and analyzed collectively. The case became an important reminder that missing person investigations require careful attention, especially when young people disappear under uncertain circumstances. The investigation also highlighted the importance of preserving evidence and maintaining accuracy when dealing with large-scale crimes. Because Coral died before trial, investigators had to reconstruct the case without the participation of the main offender. They depended on physical evidence, forensic examinations, and statements from Brooks and Henley. Every conclusion required careful verification. The recovery of remains from multiple burial locations, the identification of victims, and the comparison of testimony with physical findings created the foundation for understanding what had happened. The investigation demonstrated that even without a confession from the primary offender, a carefully constructed evidence-based case can reveal the truth. Over the decades following the case, advances in science continued to contribute to the historical record. Some victims whose identities were uncertain during the original investigation were later identified through improved forensic methods, including DNA analysis. These developments showed that time does not always end an investigation. Families who waited decades for answers could still receive information because of continued scientific progress. The Houston case, therefore, became not only a historical example of criminal investigation, but also a reminder that unresolved questions can sometimes be answered long after the original events. Despite the extensive investigation, some questions remain. The possibility of additional victims beyond the 29 officially confirmed has continued to be discussed, but no additional cases have been conclusively proven. Similarly, theories about broader criminal involvement have circulated over the years. Yet investigators have found no evidence establishing that Coral was part of a larger organization. Maintaining the distinction between confirmed facts and speculation remains essential when examining a case of this magnitude. The truth of the Houston mass murders is already significant without relying on unproven claims. The documented evidence alone reveals a tragedy of extraordinary scale. The story of Dean Coral is often remembered because of the horror of his crimes. But the most meaningful way to understand the case is to place the victims at the center. The young men who lost their lives should not be remembered only as part of a criminal statistic. Their names represent individual stories interrupted far too soon. The investigation, the trials, and the historical discussions that followed all serve a greater purpose when they preserve the memory of those victims and acknowledge the pain experienced by their families. The case remains a warning about the importance of recognizing warning signs, taking disappearances seriously, and ensuring that vulnerable people are protected. It also demonstrates the importance of persistence in the search for truth. Investigators faced an overwhelming task after August 1973, but through careful evidence collection and cooperation, they uncovered what had remained hidden for years. The work brought answers to families and established a record of what happened. Although justice could never restore the lives lost, it provided accountability for those responsible and recognition for those who were taken. More than half a century later, the Houston mass murders continue to be studied because they represent a combination of criminal manipulation, investigative challenges, forensic discovery, and human tragedy. The case is remembered not because of the offender's notoriety, but because of the lessons learned from the suffering of the victims and their families. The final chapter of this story is therefore not about Dean Corll. It is about the people whose lives were taken, the families who endured unimaginable grief, and the ongoing responsibility to remember them with dignity. Their stories remain the most important legacy of the Houston mass murders.